Hey guys, tonight we wander back into candlelit dining halls and damn hothouses of Georgian England, a world where the most sought-after treasure wasn't a diamond or a pearl, or even a particularly flattering wig. It was a spiky fruit from across the ocean. Yes, we're talking pineapples, though not the tinned ones you might find stacked at the supermarket. Imagine walking into a grand estate in the 1700s and seeing a single golden pineapple sitting proudly at the center of a polished mahogany table, treated with more reverence than some royal guests. That's how strange and delightful this story gets. And you probably won't survive the cost of admission. Literally, it could equal a year's wages for a servant just to buy or rent one fruit. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the range. From 2 a.m. night owls in New York to sunset listeners in New Zealand. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through a Georgian garden, the gravel crunching softly beneath your shoes. To your left, carefully trimmed hedges form elaborate designs. Geometry was practically a national obsession in these landscapes. But your host doesn't lead you to admire the roses or the statues of Roman gods. No, you're ushered toward a glass building glowing faintly in the evening air. Inside, the air feels tropical, almost sticky. And there it is, a pineapple perched like royalty. The pineapple's rise in England began not with local cultivation, but with faraway Caribbean voyages. Ships brought these fruits across the Atlantic, bruised and half-spoiled, but still dazzling in their exotic armor. Historians still argue whether the first pineapple to land in England came through a Spanish intermediary or a Dutch trader, but they agree on the impact. Jaws dropped. In a land where apples and pears were the common fruits, a golden-spiked orb from overseas seemed like proof of divine creativity, or at least proof that your trading connections were impeccable. And so, an obsession took root. Aristocrats wanted to own the fruit not just for its flavor, but for its symbolism. In an age obsessed with status, the pineapple announced, "Look at me, I can command the tropics." Never mind that you couldn't actually grow it in your chilly backyard. At least not yet. That detail only made the challenge more irresistible. As you imagine nibbling the air of this hothouse, you can almost hear a gardener whispering complaints. The fruit's reputation soared because of scarcity. Hardly anyone had one. A pineapple arriving fresh in London might be presented to the king, set on a table for nobles to admire, and then paraded back to the kitchen unharmed. Yes, pineapples were sometimes rented. Guests at a banquet might sigh in delight at the sight of fruit, but never actually taste it. Here's the quirky bit. Georgians even use pineapples as architectural inspiration. Across the countryside, estates sprouted whimsical buildings shaped like the fruit itself. You'd think it was satire, but they were dead serious. It was like saying, "My house can wear a pineapple hat, what's yours got?" The most famous example, the Dunmore Pineapple in Scotland, still stands as a spiky monument to the craze. And as you settle deeper into this narrative, consider the quiet absurdity. Coal fires roaring to heat glasshouses, gardeners losing sleep to guard against frost, all so that a single fruit could sit untouched on a plate for a few admiring glances. You wonder, was it worth it? Historians still debate whether the pineapple was truly loved for its flavor or whether it was simply the ultimate Georgian Instagram post, except painted in oil and lit by chandeliers. So you lean back in your chair, the flicker of a candelabrum playing across polished silver, and let the thought settle in. A society once worshipped pineapples. And tonight, as you drift, you'll trace the many layers of that obsession. From secretive gardeners and pineapple thieves to tarts and trifles that only the richest could dare to serve. You step aboard a creaking wooden vessel bound for the Caribbean, sails puffing against the salty Atlantic winds, and you realize how absurdly far a pineapple had to travel before it could sit in the middle of a Georgian table. The fruit was native to South America, cherished by the Taino people long before Europeans ever glimpsed its golden skin. By the time England was flexing its colonial muscles, Spanish and Portuguese traders were already ferrying pineapples to Europe, sometimes as exotic gifts for monarchs. Historians still argue whether King Charles II was the first English ruler to taste a fruit or simply the first to pose dramatically beside one. What we do know, in 1661, there's a famous painting by Hendrik Dankerts showing the king accepting a pineapple from his gardener, John Rose. It's not clear the fruit was really grown in England or just was in it for royal effect, but the message was clear enough. The pineapple was a status symbol fit for kings. Now picture yourself as a Georgian diner, tucking into boiled beef or mutton, dishes heavy with suet and gravy. Suddenly, a spiky, honey-scented fruit appears. No wonder the English elite swooned. The pineapple's sharp sweetness was unlike anything in their orchards, a bold contrast to the berries and apples of their fields. Even the smell, a lush tropical perfume, felt like a passport to another world. One Georgian hostess wrote in her diary that merely holding a pineapple was to clasp sunshine itself. Romantic, yes, but she probably had sticky fingers afterward. Of course, bringing the fruit home wasn't simple. Ships battled storms, rot, and impatient captains. Pineapples spoil fast, and without refrigeration, only the hardiest specimens survived the voyage. Quirky tidbit. Some pineapples were preserved in brandy during the trip, arriving more like drunken relics than fresh fruit. Admirers didn't mind. They were proof of imperial reach. This scarcity created a peculiar economy. Imagine being a London fruit seller in the early 1700s. You might put one pineapple in the window, drawing crowds who didn't dare buy but happily gawked. The fruit was like a celebrity cameo. Fleeting, glamorous, untouchable. Nobles hired artists to sketch pineapples they couldn't afford to taste. You can almost laugh imagining an aristocrat flipping through a book of fruit engravings, sighing as though a drawing could quench their craving. At the same time, Caribbean plantations began producing pineapples in earnest, and here lies the darker layer. Enslaved labor was central to cultivation and export sugar, and pineapples piggybacked on the same systems. Historians still argue whether pineapple shipments significantly affected plantation economies, but the symbolism is chilling. A fruit displayed in Georgian drawing rooms came from the toil of people denied freedom. Yet the Georgian hosts rarely saw the irony. They toasted their guests with pineapple punch, never connecting the sweetness to chains. On the lighter side, pineapples also traveled as botanical curiosities. Wealthy naturalists wrote letters about them with almost romantic longing. One gentleman marveled at their courage to thrive where no other fruit dares, which sounds dramatic until you remember he was talking about a plant that sometimes fell over under its own weight. Another delighted in sketching the spiral patterns of the fruit, hinting at divine geometry. He wasn't entirely wrong. Modern math calls it the Fibonacci sequence, though the Georgians just called it pretty. By the mid-1700s, pineapples had moved beyond mere novelty. They became diplomatic tokens. An ambassador might offer a pineapple at court the way you, or I might bring a bottle of wine to dinner. It said, "Here is proof of our empire's reach, and also I spent a ridiculous amount of money on this fruit. So please be impressed." You imagine the scene. Powdered wigs bobbing, gowns rustling, silver platters polished so fiercely they reflected candlelight like little suns. At the center of it all, one pineapple, its spines catching the glow. Guests leaned in, murmuring admiration, perhaps sniffing the air. Did they taste it? Sometimes. But often the fruit was set aside, too valuable to cut. It might appear at 3 more dinners, slowly shriveling, until finally sacrificed for a few bites, or composted, mourned like a fallen celebrity. And so, through voyages across treacherous seas, pineapple mania entered Georgian England. It wasn't just about eating. It was about showing you had the connections, the wealth, and the sheer audacity to bring the tropics into your frosty little island. And tonight, as you drift further into the story, you might smile at the thought. In an age before Instagram, pineapples were the ultimate post, captioned only with candlelight and envy. You step from the salty docks back into the misty Georgian countryside, where a new challenge takes shape. If pineapples spoil too quickly to import in bulk, why not grow them right here in England? Of course, the obvious problem is that England's climate is about as pineapple-friendly as a snowstorm in July. Yet the aristocracy, never ones to accept impossible as an answer when reputation was at stake, devised an ambitious solution. The pinery, a greenhouse designed to trick tropical plants into thinking Kent was Kingston, Jamaica. You picture the first of these strange buildings, long glass-fronted corridors with sloping roofs angled just so toward the sun. Behind the glass, rows of spiky pineapple plants sit in neat terracotta pots, like prickly soldiers in formation. Gardeners shovel coal into furnaces to keep the air warm, their sleeves rolled up, faces smudged with soot. The pineapple, sitting smugly, seems to demand constant babysitting. Historians still argue whether these early pineries were worth the colossal expense, but their mere existence tells you something about Georgian determination, or maybe stubborn vanity. The construction was no small feat. Glass was expensive, heavily taxed and fragile. To cover the long roofs of a pinery required not only wealth, but the willingness to replace panes shattered by winter storms. Then came the heating systems. Intricate channels under floors, sometimes filled with hot air from coal fires, sometimes warmed by fermenting manure pits. Yes, you heard that right. Rotting horse dung was a legitimate heating option. If you close your eyes, you can almost smell the mingling of sweet pineapple scent with pungent manure. Not exactly the fragrance of tropical paradise, but apparently good enough to keep the plants alive. A quirky tidbit emerges here. Gardeners occasionally slept inside these glasshouses to monitor the fires through the night. Imagine lying on a straw cot, the orange glow of embers flickering against the glass, while a row of pineapples looked back at you like watchful hedgehogs. The job wasn't glamorous, but for some, it was steady work, and perhaps a chance to sneak a bite if no one was looking. Despite the effort, success was not guaranteed. Pineapples took years to mature, and many plants withered before fruiting. Owners bragged about every small victory. A guest book from one estate records visitors crowding around a single green pineapple no larger than a fist, marveling as though it were a newborn prince. When at last the fruit ripened, it was paraded through drawing rooms like a relic. And should it reach the dinner table intact, the host basked in glory. One famous case was Sir Matthew Decker, a Dutch merchant settled in England, who by 1715 managed to produce pineapples in his Surrey estate. He held a celebrated feast where the fruit was served, causing such a stir that gossip about it reached the newspapers. From then on, the pineapple craze spread like wildfire among the wealthy. Everyone wanted one. Estates began competing not just in gardens and stables, but in who could coax the finest pineapple from the stubborn English soil. Now here's where humor seeps in. Sometimes the fruits looked odd, misshapen, underripe, or pale, but no host dared admit failure. Guests were told these pineapples were rare varieties, and anyone too polite or too sleepy to argue simply nodded. Historians still argue whether most Georgians even knew what a properly ripe pineapple tasted like. Some probably thought it was supposed to be tart and woody, but who cares, as long as it impressed neighbors. The obsession also created a culture of secrecy. Recipes for soil mixtures, tricks with hotbeds, and techniques for shading the glass were guarded like state secrets. Rival gardeners might sneak into each other's estates to spy on arrangements. Imagine a midnight duel, not with swords, but with stolen notes about compost ratios. It sounds ridiculous, but then again, these were fruits worth their weight in gold. Your feet crunch on the gravel path as you leave one of these steamy glasshouses, wiping sweat from your brow despite the frosty night outside. Behind you, a gardener fusses with the thermometer the size of a loaf of bread, muttering about coal expenses. Ahead lies the manor, where guests will soon sit down at dinner and hear whispered news that the household's pineapple has finally reached maturity. Gasps will follow, perhaps even applause. And somewhere in the corner, the gardener who lost sleep and smelled the manure will receive a polite nod. No more. So, in this section of your drifting journey, you've glimpsed the true theater of Georgian horticulture. Pineries were not just about plants. They were monuments to stubborn prestige. Coal, glass, and labor were poured into them as if they were cathedrals, all in the hope of nurturing a single fruit. And as you let that absurd image settle, the glowing glasshouse, the huddled gardener, the proud yet prickly pineapple, you can't help but smile. Sometimes history is less about practicality and more about putting on a very expensive show. You stroll farther into the Georgian estate, and the architecture itself begins to whisper about pineapples. Not the plants this time, but buildings, actual stone and brick structures shaped, decorated, or crowned with the fruit of the tropics. It sounds like satire, like something a cartoonist would sketch after too much sherry. Yet these were serious endeavors. Wealthy landowners wanted the pineapple not only on their tables, but also etched into their skylines. The most famous survivor is Scotland's Dunmore Pineapple, a garden folly so spectacularly bizarre that you almost laugh aloud when you see it. Imagine a dignified stone pavilion built around 1761, stately and symmetrical, with a pineapple bursting from its roof like a botanical firework. The fruit is 37 feet tall, each leaf carved in stone with such crisp detail that raindrops roll down like they would on the real thing. Historians still argue whether the 4th Earl of Dunmore meant it as a cheeky joke or a bold declaration of wealth, but either way, the neighbors definitely noticed. As you picture this, the idea spreads across England in your mind's eye. Pineapple motifs crept into iron gates, fireplace rounds, and bedposts. You walk through a drawing room where the wallpaper repeats with golden pineapples. The chairs, upholstered in silk, boast embroidered pineapples on the backrests. Even door knockers were shaped like miniature pineapples, greeting visitors with a polite metallic thud of tropical ambition. The fruit became a shorthand for hospitality. To knock on a pineapple was to promise welcome, though one suspect of servants still peeked suspiciously through the curtains before answering. Quirky tidbit. At some country houses, mock stone pineapples topped gateposts, making arrivals feel as if they were entering a fruit-themed kingdom. The effect was both majestic and faintly ridiculous, as though the estate were sponsored by a tropical grocer. Still, guests took it seriously. Pineapples symbolized generosity, warmth, and cosmopolitan taste. The irony, of course, was that the same fruit remained largely an inedible decoration for most who saw it. Inside these grand houses, orangeries, originally designed for citrus, were expanded into full pineries, and then extended further into whimsical spaces where form mattered as much as function. You imagine strolling along corridors glazed with enormous panes, coal fires rumbling beneath, the air thick with damp heat. Your powdered wig begins to droop, and you mutter under your breath about the expense. Yet your host beams with pride, gesturing toward the architecture as though it were proof of divine favor. The pineapple became such a marker of taste that architects themselves competed to weave the motif into commissions. An eccentric clergyman once wrote that a gentleman who has not a pineapple upon his roof might as well eat porridge daily. That may have been tongue-in-cheek, but the sentiment rang true. Pineapples were woven into identity. To lack them, or at least the symbols of them, risked appearing provincial. Historians still debate how much of this architecture was sincere admiration versus playful absurdity. Was the Dunmore pineapple a serious brag or a wink at the silliness of it all? In truth, both interpretations probably applied. Georgian culture thrived on double meanings. Display and irony could coexist under the same carved stone. You can almost hear the chuckle of an architect handing his patron the design, whispering, "Yes, my lord, it shall be the largest fruit in Scotland." And so, as you let your gaze drift across spiky silhouettes etched against the dusk, the pineapple ceases to be just a plant. It becomes a language, an emblem chiseled into rooftops and ironmongery. A visitor might not get a taste of fruit, but they would certainly see it. And seeing was half the point. Just like a luxury car in a driveway today, the Georgian Pineapple House said, "I've arrived, and I brought a tropical crown with me." The absurdity grows sleepily charming as you imagine drifting past these strange monuments, candlelight glowing in windows beneath fruit-shaped finials. It's as though England itself decided that if it couldn't be the Caribbean, it would at least cosplay as one in architecture. And with that image, stone pineapples towering against gray skies, you drift onward, smiling at the thought of a country so smitten by a fruit that it built houses in its honor. You leave the garden follies behind and step into a glittering dining hall, candles trembling in crystal chandeliers, polished silver reflecting flickers of gold. Here the pineapple takes on a new role. Not merely a fruit or a decoration, but a weapon in the subtle art of diplomacy. In Georgian England, a pineapple was not just something to eat. It was something to offer, a token that spoke louder than words at royal banquets and ambassadorial dinners. Picture yourself seated at a long mahogany table, elbow to elbow with powdered wigs and brocaded gowns. Platters of roasted venison, tureens of turtle soup, and bowls of jellied eels pass along the line. Yet all eyes fix on the centerpiece, a pineapple, resting proudly like a spiky crown. It doesn't need to be sliced. Its mere presence whispers, our connections reach farther than yours. Historians still argue whether monarchs actually enjoyed eating the fruit or whether they savored the spectacle more. But the pineapple's use as a diplomatic symbol is clear. When presented to a visiting envoy, it conveyed more than hospitality. It said, we command the seas, we control trade, and we can summon the tropics to our chilly isle. Subtle? Hardly. Effective? Absolutely. Quirky tidbit. Sometimes the fruit wasn't even consumed at these banquets. Instead, it was paraded around, admired, and then returned intact to the host's pantry, ready to impress at tomorrow's dinner. A pineapple might enjoy a week-long diplomatic career, hopping from feast to feast, before finally succumbing to the knife. By then, it was often past its prime, but no one cared. Its value had already been extracted in size of envy. In royal households, pineapples could even inspire envy among staff. Servants might boast that they worked in a home where pineapples were kept. Gardeners were sworn to secrecy about cultivation methods, and kitchen staff guarded the fruit like treasure. Imagine being a scullery maid sneaking a sniff of the exotic perfume while carrying chamber pots. It was as close as most people came to empire. The pineapple also shaped etiquette. Hosts competed to serve the fruit in creative ways. Sliced into tarts, steeped in wine, or presented in silver baskets. A guest lucky enough to receive a wedge was expected to praise extravagantly, perhaps comparing to ambrosia or the nectar of the gods. To wrinkle one's nose at the taste would have been social suicide. Of course, privately, some found it a bit too sharp. Georgian palates, used to heavily sugared dishes, weren't always ready for the tang of a ripe pineapple. But no one dared admit it. Diplomatic pineapples didn't stay confined to England. They traveled abroad too, sent to French courts or displayed in Russia, where Catherine the Great reportedly admired the fruit, but wasn't terribly interested in eating it. The Ottoman court received shipments as well, sometimes alongside peacocks or exotic parrots. In a parade of global curiosities, the pineapple stood out for its portability. Less noisy than a bird, less messy than a camel, but just as effective at making people stare. And here's the comic twist. The very act of gifting a pineapple sometimes caused logistical headaches. By the time the fruit arrived, bruised and wilted, its glamour had faded. Diplomats covered the blemishes with elaborate displays. Silver stands, fresh leaves glued on to disguise decay. If you close your eyes, you can almost see a flustered courtier trying to attach new leaves with wax while muttering, "No one will notice. Just put it near the candles." You sip an imaginary glass of claret, watching this dance of politics and fruit unfold. The pineapple, perched in the center, is no longer just a fruit. It is a conversation starter, a bargaining chip, a silent boast. And you think to yourself, history can be serious, yes, but sometimes it's deliciously absurd. To impress an ambassador, all it took was one golden ore from the tropics. As the candles burn lower and the wine grows heavy, you hear the gentle murmur of diplomacy around you. Words rise and fall, but the pineapple glows steadily, saying everything without uttering a sound. And you, drifting towards sleep, let that image carry you, a fruit that became the quietest and perhaps the most ridiculous diplomat England ever had. You slip quietly from the banquet hall into the shadowed corridors of the manor, where the true labor behind pineapple glory unfolds. For every glittering pineapple displayed in silver baskets, there were servants and gardeners working in secrecy, fussing over fires, pots, and manure heaps to keep the fruits alive in an utterly alien climate. You imagine them creeping out of bed in the middle of the night, lanterns swaying, checking the thermometer in the glasshouse like anxious parents tending a feverish child. The pineapple's survival depended on constant vigilance. Too much heat, and the leaves wilted. Too little, and frost nipped the plant in minutes. Fires had to be stoked at precise intervals. Gardeners often worked in shifts, sleeping in cots beside the furnaces, their dreams perfumed with coal, smoke, and damp earth. Quirky tidbit. Some estates kept a rotation of young boys specifically to carry coal to the pineries, their faces blackened with soot long before breakfast was served upstairs. The irony, of course, was that the family bragged about the pineapple's natural sunshine, while entire teams sweated in darkness to fake the tropics. Historians still argue whether estate owners truly understood the backbreaking routines their servants endured. Diaries suggest some masters did, recording in detail the struggles of gardeners against the English weather. Others wrote only of the triumph, the proud moment of unveiling a ripe fruit at dinner. The invisible labor remained invisible. Secrecy was paramount. Recipes for soil, manure blends, and watering schedules were guarded like royal documents. Gardeners signed oaths not to reveal techniques to rivals. Some even invented misleading tricks, such as sprinkling mysterious powders or muttering Latin phrases over plants, just to throw off spying visitors. Imagine trying to sneak into a greenhouse at midnight, tiptoeing past guards, only to find yourself nose first in a steaming manure pit. Not exactly James Bond material, but in Georgian terms, this was espionage at its finest. And theft did happen. A ripe pineapple was so valuable that estate owners sometimes hire guards or set dogs to patrol the gardens. Tales spread of fruits disappearing overnight, leaving only chewed stalks behind. Did thieves eat them, sell them, or simply revel in the mischief? No one knows. But the fear was real enough that gardeners were interrogated, accused of smuggling fruits to black markets. One poor gardener in Bath reportedly lost his position after a pineapple under his care mysteriously vanished. Whether stolen or eaten, the scandal ended his career. Inside the manor, secrecy continued. Servants carrying pineapples to the dining room were drilled like soldiers. Hands had to be gloved, steps measured so the fruit wouldn't bruise. If a guest asked to touch the pineapple, permission had to be granted by the master alone. Imagine a footman standing stiffly, cradling a fruit as if it were a royal baby, terrified that one slip might cost him his job. All this effort meant that pineapples became tokens of both pride and paranoia. The households boasted of them, yet feared for them. It was like owning a celebrity pet that might die at any moment. Guests whispered about which estates had pineries and which didn't, and gardeners' reputations soared or sank on the survival of a single plant. Now, as you walk back toward your imaginary glasshouse, the warmth hits you in the face. The windows glow faintly, condensation streaking the panes. Inside, a gardener crouches with candle, inspecting a young pineapple. The leaves shine green, the fruit still small, and he exhales in relief. Another day saved. Tomorrow, the ritual will begin again. Coal hauled, manure mixed, fires fed. And in a few months, if fortune smiles, the household will unveil its triumph in the dining hall, as though it appeared by magic. You can't help but chuckle at the absurdity. Aristocrats dreamed of paradise, but what they got was a crew of exhausted men covered in soot and compost, swearing under their breath. The pineapple stood for elegance, but behind the scenes it was all sweat and secrecy. And as you drift off, you sense how fragile glory can be. Guarded by servants, hidden in glass, glowing for a moment before vanishing into history's compost heap. You slip back into the dining hall, but tonight the pineapple in the center isn't destined to be eaten. It's destined to be rented. Yes, in Georgian England you could hire a pineapple like you might hire a carriage or a string quartet. Picture a fruit that traveled from dinner to dinner, perched proudly on silver platters, admired by guests who had no idea the spiky celebrity had already appeared at 3 other parties that week. The logic was simple. Pineapples were far too expensive for most households to buy outright. A single fruit might cost the equivalent of thousands of pounds today. Yet the social cachet of displaying one was irresistible. And so, entrepreneurial hothouse owners began renting them out. You'd pay a fee, showcase the fruit to dazzle your guests, then discreetly return it before it turned too soft. The pineapple lived a life of performance, passed around like a theater prop. Historians still argue whether most guests ever tasted a bite of these rented fruits. Some accounts suggest they remained whole, merely admired and photographed in oil paints. Others hint that hosts would cut off a thin slice, then carefully glue the crown back on and disguise the missing chunk with clever arrangements of leaves. A quirky tidbit emerges here. One satirical cartoon from the period shows a pineapple looking exhausted, slumped on a platter with the caption, "Another engagement this evening." Imagine yourself as a guest, seated at the table, your powdered wig itching, eyes fixed on the glittering fruit. Do you dare ask for a slice? Likely not. You'd know it was more valuable as spectacle than sustenance. Perhaps you lean toward your neighbor and whisper, "Remarkable specimen," pretending you know exactly what pineapple should taste like. Meanwhile, your host beams, secretly calculating whether the rental was worth the gossip it would spark. This peculiar economy of rental turned the fruit into a theatrical commodity. Pineapples circulated through townhouses like actors making cameo appearances. London society pages even reported on which households had displayed one recently. A pineapple sighting became a headline event. It was like spotting a celebrity in Soho, only spikier and with less scandal. Of course, mishaps occurred. One story tells of a rented pineapple that collapsed halfway through a banquet, its skin splitting under the heat of too many candles. Guests gasped as though a crown jewel had cracked. The host, mortified, tried to pass it off as an experiment in tropical cookery. Everyone politely clapped, though later diaries suggest they laughed about it for weeks. The absurdity becomes clearer when you realize that the fruit might never even have been tasted by the person paying for it. Imagine buying bragging rights without ever enjoying the goods. It was like paying for an orchestra, but keeping them in another room. Audible proof of wealth without the mess of actually listening. And yet, the rentals worked. Pineapples became symbols of both aspiration and ingenuity. They allowed middling aristocrats or wealthy merchants hoping to climb the ladder to play at grandeur without building an entire pinery. For one glittering evening, they could bask in the glow of tropical prestige, even if the fruit returned quietly to its true owner at dawn. Now, as you picture the pineapple's weary journey, hopping from carriage to carriage, dining room to dining room, you feel a sleepy amusement. The fruit lived a life of endless appearances, admired, envied, never allowed to rest. You wonder, if pineapples had feelings, would they have sighed at their fate? Perhaps, in some tropical dream, they longed only to ripen in peace. But in Georgian England, they were celebrities, forever on tour, forever admired, forever out of reach. You wander through a candlelit gallery, where gilt frames line the walls, and suddenly notice a familiar silhouette. There is again a pineapple perched proudly in oil paint. In Georgian England, the fruit leapt from dining tables into canvases and sketchbooks, becoming a muse for artists who understood just how much prestige it carried. If you couldn't grow one, you could at least be painted with one. Portraits of aristocrats often featured pineapples casually resting on tables beside their subjects. A nobleman might stand stiffly in his embroidered coat, one hand on his hip, the other gesturing toward a fruit that practically shouted, "Yes, I own the tropics." A duchess might cradle a pineapple the way one might cradle a lapdog, as if the spiky oil were both accessory and companion. Historians still argue whether these pineapples were painted from real fruit in the room or copied from sketches passed among artists. Either way, they were badges of worldly sophistication. Still life painters adored them too. You can almost see the table. Grapes spilling from a silver bowl, peaches glowing softly, a pheasant lying artfully on its side, and right in the middle, a pineapple upright like a golden sentinel. It commanded the viewer's attention, as if everything else were mere backdrop. Quirky tidbit. In some paintings, the pineapple appears suspiciously perfect. Every leaf symmetrical, every scale gleaming, suggesting the artist hadn't seen one in person, but was working from rumor and imagination. Beyond portraits, pineapples even invaded architectural sketches and decorative drawings. Pattern books or wallpaper or fabrics sometimes included stylized pineapple motifs, meant to give even middle-class homes a whiff of exotic grandeur. Owning the real fruit might be impossible, but you could sleep beneath wallpapered pineapples and dream of sugar plantations you'd never visit. Patrons took this seriously. To be painted with a pineapple was to declare your ties to empire, commerce, and modern taste. In one famous portrait, Charles II himself is depicted with the fruit, though whether he had truly grown it in England is doubtful. The symbolism mattered more than botanical accuracy. To Georgians, the pineapple was shorthand for global reach, a kind of edible passport stamped with status. But satire wasn't far behind. Caricaturists lampooned the trend. sketching nouveau riche merchants clutching pineapples too large for their hands, or dandies boasting about their fruit while their wigs slipped askew. These images tease the pretentiousness of displaying such a rare object. Imagine strolling into a print shop on Fleet Street, chuckling at a cartoon of a portly alderman bowing before a pineapple as though it were a monarch. In the quiet of the gallery, you picture artists sighing with relief whenever a pineapple commission came through. A single fruit could elevate a painting from provincial to cosmopolitan, from ordinary to extraordinary. And for the sitter, the fruit promised immortality, not just of their face, but of their taste. Long after the pineapple rotted, the painted version lived on, flawless and fragrant only in imagination. So you drift through this corridor of gilded frames, noting pineapples tucked into every other canvas, smiling at the absurdity of a fruit that became an icon of paint and pigment. It's as a Georgian society collectively decided that if pineapples couldn't last on the table, they would last forever in oil. And as your eyes grow heavy, you realize that in some ways they did. You wander deeper into the manor library, where the air smells of leather and candle wax, and discover that pineapples didn't only live in glasshouses, kitchens, or paintings. They seeped into words. Georgian England produced an entire crop of diaries, poems, pamphlets, and playful essays that feature the fruit as both metaphor and marvel. It was as if once the pineapple entered the country, writers couldn't resist turning it into ink. In personal diaries, hosts often recorded the triumphant moment of unveiling a pineapple at dinner. A most delightful fruit, one hostess scrawled in her neat hand, which was admired by all and consumed in a spirit of gratitude. Her husband, less poetic, noted only, cost more than the horse. That's the contrast you find, rapturous all beside grumbling practicality. Historians still argue whether these diary entries reveal genuine love for fruit's taste or simply pride in its rarity. But either way, they reveal just how carefully pineapples were documented. Poets, too, got on the act. Alexander Pope made passing references, while lesser-known Georgian poets compared pineapples to sunburst jewels or even heavenly visions. Quirky tidbit. One particularly florid poem described a pineapple as a monarch's heart clad in golden armor, which sounds impressive until you remember that, at its core, it's still fibrous and a bit stringy. Pamphleteers and essayists use the fruit metaphorically. To praise someone's charm, they might call them the very pineapple of politeness. To insult someone's arrogance, they might mutter that the person displayed pineapples they never paid for. The fruit became a linguistic currency, as the society itself needed shorthand for worldly excellence. You can almost imagine Georgian gossip in the coffee houses. Did you hear Lord So-So display 3 pineapples last night? Indeed, sir, but were they his own or borrowed? Cookbooks also feature the fruit, though sparingly, since most readers couldn't dream of affording it. One author included a recipe for pineapple pudding, noting helpfully that apples may be substituted when the pineapple cannot be had. Which is to say, always. Still, the recipe lingered on the page like a culinary fairy tale. Then there were the newspapers, where society columns breathlessly reported pineapple appearances. At the Duchess of Devonshire's soiree, a pineapple of uncommon size was displayed. Such notes weren't trivial. They shaped reputations. To have your pineapple mentioned in print was to prove your place among the elite. Satirical papers mocked this frenzy, publishing fake reports of pineapples at ordinary taverns, poking fun at the idea that fruit could carry social weight. What fascinates you most, though, is how the pineapple became a metaphor for aspiration itself. In sermons, ministers compared spiritual growth to the cultivation of a pineapple, slow, costly, requiring constant vigilance. In novels, authors slipped the fruit into scenes to mark characters as wealthy or foolish. And in letters, lovers compared their affections to the sweetness of pineapple juice, though one imagines the recipient might have preferred roses. As you trail your fingers along the spines of these leather-bound books, you can almost hear the scratch of quills, the hum of conversation, the chuckle of printers setting pineapple headlines in type. The fruit wasn't just seen. It was written, repeated, and immortalized in words that outlasted its short shelf life. And so you drift on, amused by the idea that Georgian society turned a tropical fruit into poetry, gossip, sermons, and satire. Tonight, In this candlelit library of the past, you realize the pineapple was never just eaten. It was narrated, rhymed, and endlessly rewritten until it became less a fruit than a story everyone wanted to tell. You push open a heavy oak door and step into the study of a Georgian gentleman. Paper strewn across his desk, maps of the Atlantic pinned to the walls. It's here you see the deeper story behind a glittering pineapple, its roots in colonial currents. For all the candlelit admiration in English dining halls, the fruit's journey was bound up with plantations in the Caribbean, with ships loaded not only with pineapples, but with sugar, rum, and enslaved laborers whose lives are consumed to keep these luxuries flowing. The pineapple thrived in Caribbean soil, where the climate matched its tropical needs. Plantations cultivated alongside sugarcane, and though sugar dominated the trade, the occasional shipment of pineapples to Europe added sparkle to the empire's reputation. Quirky tidbit. In Jamaica, pineapples grew so abundantly in certain areas that locals used the spiky leaves as makeshift scrubbing brushes, a far cry from the reverence the fruit received in London drawing rooms. Historians still argue whether pineapple exports had any significant economic impact compared to sugar. Some say they were too fragile and rare to matter. Others point out that even limited exports reinforced Britain's image as master of the tropics. To display a pineapple in England was to remind guests of colonial reach, whether they tasted the fruit or not. But behind the symbolism was harsh reality. Enslaved Africans worked under brutal conditions, cultivating sugar and tending pineapples that would end up as baubles of prestige thousands of miles away. Their labor was invisible in Georgian banquets, erased by silver platters and polite applause. You sense the dissonance. Hosts praise the fruit's sun-kissed sweetness, while ignoring the human cost of that sunshine. Letters from the Caribbean sometimes painted an oddly casual picture. Planters boasted of sending pineapples back to England as gifts, often alongside rum or molasses. "A little taste of our island," one planter wrote, "for your tables in London." The word skimmed over the suffering underpinning the gift. Guests in England received the fruit with delight, never thinking of the sweat, heat, and lash that brought it there. In this study, you imagine the maps glowing in lamplight. Lines trace across the Atlantic like veins, carrying goods, wealth, and misery. Ships loaded with sugar sailed to Bristol and Liverpool, fueling fortunes. A few pineapples rode along, too, their presence more symbolic than substantial. But symbols matter. A pineapple was proof that Britain's empire reached deep into the tropics. Quirky cultural exchanges happened as well. Caribbean hosts sometimes used pineapples to welcome European visitors, cementing the fruit's association with hospitality. Over time, that symbolism seeped back into England, where pineapples crowned gateposts and appeared on dining tables. The gesture, stripped of its origins, became fashionable decoration. You lean against the desk, the candlelight flickering across the map. The pineapple you've been tracing in this story isn't just a fruit or an ornament. It's part of a vast system of trade and exploitation. Yet Georgian society chose to see only the glamour. For them, the pineapple embodied exotic delight. For those in the Caribbean, it was just another plant in fields of labor. As you leave the study, the sound of the sea rises faintly in your ears, the creak of masts, the slap of waves against hulls. Ships forever moving, carrying both delight and despair. And in Georgian England, a fruit that sat silently on a table bore within it the hidden weight of empire. You wander from the study into a quieter corner of the house, where apothecary jars and medical texts line the shelves. Here, the pineapple takes on yet another unlikely role, medicine. In Georgian England, the fruit wasn't only admired for its beauty or paraded at banquets. It was also hailed, sometimes wildly, as a cure for various ailments. Doctors and quacks alike touted pineapple juice as a tonic for digestion. They claimed it cleared obstructions of the stomach and soothed the liver. Some even prescribed it for seasickness, which sounds convenient until you remember the fruit was usually consumed only after a long, stomach-churning sea voyage. Historians still argue whether Georgians truly believed in pineapple's healing powers, or whether they simply projected medicinal virtues onto any exotic rarity. After all, if something was rare and expensive, surely it had to be good for you, right? Quirky tidbit. One physician wrote that pineapple juice could invigorate the spirits and calm the vapors, which basically meant he thought it was good for melancholy. Imagine a gloomy Georgian gentleman being told to sip pineapple juice to cheer up. In truth, the vitamin C in the fruit did help with scurvy, though oranges and lemons were far more practical remedies. But pineapple sounded more glamorous in prescription. Ladies' magazines also picked up the idea, recommending pineapple for delicate constitutions. One article suggested that pineapple wine, taken in moderation, would preserve the bloom of youth. The recipe, however, required soaking a fruit for weeks in sugar and brandy. Less a medical cure, more an excuse for tipsy evenings. Still, the association of pineapples with vitality and beauty lingered, feeding into their status as fashionable luxuries. At the same time, critics raised eyebrows. A few cautious doctors warned that the fruit's acidity might irritate the stomach, especially when eaten in excess. Some even claimed it was dangerous for pregnant women, a belief borrowed from colonial folklore. Whether true or not, these warnings only added to the pineapple's mystique, a fruit both desirable and slightly dangerous, like a velvet-wrapped sword. You picture an apothecary's counter in Bath, jars of powders and tinctures gleaming behind glass, while a pineapple sits on the shelf as if it too were medicine. A well-dressed patient leans in and whispers, "Doctor, can I try the pineapple treatment?" The doctor strokes his chin solemnly, as though weighing deep knowledge, then charges a fortune for a slice. Meanwhile, the patient goes home and marvels at the sweetness, convinced the cure is working. Historians still puzzle over how much of this was belief versus marketing. The Georgian era blurred the lines between science and spectacle. Botanists wrote earnest treatises on the pineapple's properties, while caricaturists sketched doctors prescribing pineapples for every ailment under the sun. You can almost chuckle imagining a pamphlet. Pineapple cures gout, improves complexion, may attract admirers. And yet, beneath the exaggeration, there was a grain of truth. Pineapples contain vitamins, enzymes, and refreshing juice in a diet heavy on salted meats and stodgy bread. To someone unaccustomed to tropical fruit, it really did taste like a miracle. As you leave the apothecary corner, you can hear the faint echo of a Georgian physician insisting that pineapples were more than decoration. To him, they were medicine, morale, even magic. And as you drift further into the night, you realize sometimes history's strangest cures are half-truths, half hope, and all theater. You follow the murmur of laughter and the clink of glass until you find yourself in the great dining hall again, this time in the middle of a true Georgian spectacle. The pineapple has taken center stage, not just as a garnish or a painting, but as the undisputed star of a party. Picture a long oak table dressed in damask cloth, silver candelabra blazing, dishes steaming with game pies, roasted peacocks, and towers of jellies trembling like jeweled ornaments. And right in the middle, glowing in candlelight, sits a pineapple upright and smug. At these gatherings, the fruit was as much entertainment as food. Guests leaned forward to admire it, whispering about the expense, the difficulty, the prestige. The host smiled knowingly, as though to say, "Yes, my greenhouse worked. Yes, my gardener didn't kill it this year." Historians still argue whether these fruits were served at all, or whether they were simply admired as art installations. Some accounts say pineapples were carved ceremoniously, each guest receiving a thin slice with solemnity. Others suggest they remained untouched, paraded around the table before being whisked back to the kitchen to survive another evening on tour. Quirky tidbit. On some occasions, a pineapple was so revered that guests toasted it like royalty. Glasses of claret or punch were raised to the noble fruit, followed by cheers as though the pineapple itself might offer a speech in return. Of course, it remained silent, its only contribution the faint tropical perfume drifting through the hall. The parties themselves were extravaganzas of display. In Georgian culture, the dining table was a stage for wealth and power. Pineapples were not eaten casually. They were revealed dramatically. Imagine a servant entering with silver salver, covered by a velvet cloth. With a flourish, the cover was lifted, and gasps rippled through the guests. The fruit appeared as dazzling as any crown jewel, its spines catching the light. The room might fall momentarily quiet, The pineapple commanding reverence. Theatrical as it was, there were rules. Hosts who dared to serve the fruit were expected to do so in innovative ways. Pineapple slices appeared in trifles, tarts, or even floating in wine punch. Georgian cookbooks, when they mentioned pineapple at all, offered elaborate recipes. Pineapple ice creams, pineapple preserves, even candied pineapple rinds. Yet, for most guests, a plain slice was exotic enough. To taste pineapple in 18th century England was like sampling moonlight, rare, fleeting, unforgettable. But the pressure was enormous. Hosts who failed to impress risked ridicule. Imagine a pineapple that arrived underripe, tough and sour. Guests would nibble politely, murmur about its unique character, and then gossip later about the embarrassment. In one anecdote, a host tried to disguise a failing pineapple by drenching it in sugar syrup. Guests still grimaced, and the man was teased for years. The pineapple's role at these parties reveals just how performative Georgian society could be. Food wasn't simply sustenance. It was theater, symbolism, a mirror of empire. Guests didn't just eat, they interpreted. The pineapple said, "We are connected to colonies across the seas. We command labor, ships, and wealth." It was a silent boast that floated above the laughter and clinking glasses. And as you stand at the edge of the hall, wine warming your hand, you can sense the absurd balance between awe and comedy. A fruit from the tropics turned into the centerpiece of polite society. Toasted like a monarch, feared like a diva. You almost expect the pineapple to demand better seating, or at least a cushion. As the evening fades, candles guttering, guests murmur their goodbyes. Servants whisk away the fruit to rest, perhaps to appear at yet another banquet tomorrow. And you, half dreaming, let the image linger. Pineapples glowing under chandeliers, laughter echoing, and society so enchanted by a fruit that it built entire evenings around its spiky crown. You step outside into the crisp night air, only to overhear the quieter conversations of Georgian gentlemen huddled near the fire. Here, the pineapple isn't just a banquet centerpiece. It's a tool in politics. In a world where gestures spoke louder than speeches, presenting a pineapple could grease the wheels of influence more smoothly than a pouch of coins. Picture an MP arriving at Westminster, his carriage creaking under the weight of documents, powdered wig slightly askew. He carries no scroll, no proposal, but instead a single pineapple wrapped carefully in cloth. To hand such a fruit to a fellow politician or a patron was to say, "I am connected. I have reach. I can offer you the rarest taste in the kingdom." Historians still argue whether pineapples genuinely change votes or merely sweeten the atmosphere, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Whoever controlled pineapples controlled prestige. Quirky tidbit. In one satirical cartoon, a politician is shown cradling a pineapple while whispering promises into the ear of a colleague. The caption reads, "More persuasive than pamphlets." It was absurd but also telling. Pamphlets might be burned, but a pineapple was unforgettable. In the royal court, pineapples served as tokens of loyalty. To present one to the monarch was to flaunt not only wealth but devotion. Imagine George III, beset by debates and ministers, pausing to admire a pineapple as though it were a sign that the empire was working just fine. The fruit became a shorthand for prosperity, a golden orb promising stability amid political turbulence. And politics bled into private circles. A merchant hoping to secure a contract might invite an influential official to dinner, ensuring a pineapple sat prominently on the table. Whether eaten or not, the message was clear. I can deliver what others cannot. Guests rarely miss a point. But pineapples weren't always on the side of power. They could also be tools of mockery. Satirical poets mocked officials who flaunted pineapples but failed at their duties. He grows fruits but not solutions. One wrote, poking fun at minister more skilled in horticultural display than governance. The fruit's association with vanity made it ripe, pardon the pun, for political satire. Even parliamentary debates sometimes reference the fruit. One witty speaker compared a rival's policies to a pineapple. Exotic, costly, and indigestible. Laughter rippled through the chamber, proving that even in the midst of national issues, the pineapple remained on the tip of society's tongue. As you picture this, you see how the fruit transcended its botanical roots. It wasn't just a luxury food or a piece of decor. It was currency, soft, spiky currency traded in smiles, favors, and alliances. The pineapple became a silent participant in Georgian politics, perched on tables, whispered about in corridors, and mocked in prints sold on Fleet Street. And as you drift further into the story, you sense the double edge. The fruit could secure favor, but it could also expose vanity. It was both bribe and joke, both asset and liability. In Georgian England, politics didn't always hinge on policy. It sometimes hinged on who could produce the juiciest pineapple. You step away from the firelight, the chatter of politicians fading behind you, and smile at the thought. Somewhere, in a chilly glasshouse tended by weary gardeners, another fruit is ripening, destined not for dessert but for debate. You wander down a corridor lined with portraits of ladies in satin gowns, pearls glimmering at their necks, and notice that pineapples sneak into their world too. Not as politics this time, but as symbols of femininity and grace. In Georgian England, the fruit became strangely entangled with ideas about gender, beauty, and social expectation. Imagine a young debutante stepping into her first grand ball, nervous beneath the glittering chandeliers. If she was presented holding a pineapple, it suggested refinement, delicacy, and exotic allure. The fruit, rare and carefully nurtured, was likened to a woman's reputation. Fragile, precious, requiring constant attention. Historians still argue whether this association was sincere admiration or a sly form of objectification. But the imagery persisted. Quirky tidbit. One satirical print shows a lady in an enormous gown balancing a pineapple on her head, as though it were part of her hairstyle. The caption teased the new fashion of fruit, poking fun at both vanity and the craze. Yet beneath the humor, the symbolism was real. To be linked with pineapples was to be linked with luxury, desirability, and the promise of sweetness. Writers often extended the metaphor. A well-bred lady was described as the pineapple of the season, which was both a compliment and a reminder of scarcity. There could only be one. Women themselves sometimes leaned into the imagery, wearing pineapple motifs embroidered into gowns or jewelry, signaling both wealth and trendiness. The fruit was exotic, fashionable, and just risky enough to suggest daring taste. But the pineapple could also serve as a cautionary tale. Some sermons warned young women against being too like the pineapple. All outward show, little substance. Others suggested that beauty without modesty was as fleeting as the fruit's ripeness. Glowing today, spoiled tomorrow. The double message was clear. Admire the pineapple, yes, but don't become it. At social gatherings, women might be offered the first slice of pineapple as a gesture of honor. To taste it was to participate in a ritual of refinement. Yet some diaries record women finding the fruit too sharp, even unpleasant. They smiled politely anyway, unwilling to break the illusion. The pineapple was less about flavor and more about performance, much like the endless dances and curtsies that filled their evenings. And in portraits, pineapples added layers of meaning. A lady painted beside a pineapple hinted at her family's wealth and her own cultivated elegance. The fruit became shorthand for quality society demanded. Beauty carefully managed, exotic yet contained, sweet but never too bold. You can almost hear the painter murmuring, "Hold still, madam, and tilt the fruit just so. It says everything without your having to say a word." As you stroll past these portraits, candlelight flickering across powdered faces and spiky silhouettes, you sense how tightly the pineapple was woven into ideas of gender. Women were praised for embodying its sweetness. Mocked they flaunted it too boldly, and forever measured against its fragile perfection. And you, drifting in a half-silence of the gallery, can't help but smile at the absurdity. An entire society using a tropical fruit as a yardstick for femininity. Yet here it is, immortalized in gowns, paintings, and poems. In Georgian England, the pineapple wasn't just a fruit. It was a mirror, reflecting the ideals and anxieties of the women who carried its symbolic weight. You step outside into the chilly night, where the estate grounds feel quieter, almost conspiratorial. The air carries whispers of scandal, because not all pineapples live their lives in polite admiration. Some were stolen, spirited away from glasshouses and guarded plots, as if they were crown jewels rather than fruit. The value was irresistible. A single ripe pineapple could fetch enough money to equal months of a laborer's wages. Gardeners and footmen were constantly tempted, and sometimes gave in. Quirky tidbit. One report from Bath mentions a gardener dismissed in disgrace when his estate's prized pineapple vanished overnight. The poor man insisted it had fallen to blight. But neighbors soon spotted a suspiciously spiky centerpiece at a tavern feast. Historians still argue whether these thefts were common or merely exaggerated by gossip. Either way, the fear of them was real. Some estate owners employed guards to patrol their hothouses. Dogs were stationed nearby. Keys jingled on the gardener's belt like the keeper of a prison. Imagine tiptoeing to the dark, hoping to sneak one fruit, only to be caught by a hound barking at your heels. And sometimes the thieves weren't commoners, but rivals. Wealthy neighbors jealous of a successful crop occasionally sent spies to snoop around pineries. Whispered rumors spoke of bribed servants carrying out young plants wrapped in cloth, smuggling them to rival estates. It sounds like a horticultural spy novel, except the prize was not state secrets, but a particularly plump pineapple. The thefts gave the fruit an aura of danger. Owning one was not just expensive, it was precarious. A pineapple might rot too soon, collapse on a candle-heated banquet, or disappear altogether. For hosts, this uncertainty added drama. Each successful unveiling was a victory not just over climate, but over chance and crime. One diary describes the humiliation of a hostess whose pineapple centerpiece was discovered to be a fake, made of wax, carefully painted, standing in until the real fruit ripened. Guests whispered behind their fans, and the poor woman's reputation wilted faster than the imitation fruit. It wasn't theft, but it felt just as scandalous. You wander past a greenhouse now, its glass panes gleaming faintly under moonlight. Inside, the pineapples squat like soldiers, each one precious, each one guarded by locks and nerves. A gardener shifts in his sleep nearby, knowing that his livelihood rests on keeping those spiky crowns intact. One fruit gone astray, and his future collapses. It strikes you how absurdly high the stakes were. All this secrecy, paranoia, and the occasional whiff of crime, all for a fruit that, in the end, might not even be eaten. Yet this was Georgian England's reality. Pineapples were treasure. They were stolen, copied, rented, paraded, and sometimes mourned as though they were lost children. And so you drift further into the night, amused and faintly saddened. In a world obsessed with appearances, even theft had its place in the pineapple story. Some fruits dazzled in candlelight. Others vanished into shadows. And as you breathe in the cool air, you wonder, if you've been a Georgian gardener, could you have resisted sneaking one spiky crown under your coat? You wander back into the estate ledger's room, where parchment sheets smell faintly of ink and mildew, and you discover the true backbone of pineapple prestige. The economy behind it. Growing a single fruit in Georgian England wasn't just gardening. It was an enterprise, one that demanded coal, glass, labor, and money by the sackful. First came the buildings themselves. A proper pinery could cost more than a small house. Architects designed long brick corridors with sloped glass roofs, angled to catch every weak ray of English sun. Glass was expensive, taxed heavily, and fragile. Storm damage meant constant replacement. Some landowners boasted of importing Dutch panes, whispering as though the glass itself were part of the fruit's pedigree. Then there was the heating. Fires had to be maintained day and night. Coal shoveled endlessly to keep the air tropical. One estate account book reveals that heating a pinery could consume more coal in a year than the kitchens of the manor itself. Quirky tidbit. Some gardeners experimented with tan pits, beds of rotting bark and manure that generated heat as they decayed. It worked, but it also produced a smell that clung to wigs and gowns alike. Dinner guests would murmur about the tropical fragrance, though one suspects it wasn't quite as exotic as advertised. Historians still argue whether the cost of these fruits outweighed their social benefits. For many landowners, the answer didn't matter. Prestige was priceless, and showing off a pineapple at dinner could secure alliances worth far more than coal or glass. But servants and stewards grumbled. Accounts survived where estate managers practically begged their lords to cut expenses. The cost of heating is unsustainable, one wrote, and the pineapple's most uncertain in yield. His master ignored him. Of course. Labor, too, added to the tally. Gardeners had to be trained in specialized skills, monitoring humidity, soil acidity, and temperature with obsessive precision. Wages for these men were higher than for ordinary estate hands. If a pineapple withered, it wasn't just a botanical failure. It was a financial disaster. Some gardeners lost jobs, reputations, even livelihoods over a single shriveled fruit. And yet, pineapples weren't always sold to be eaten. Many were display only, rented or exhibited for weeks. That meant the fruit had to be managed like an asset, protected, rotated between events, sometimes polished to look fresh longer. Imagine the absurdity. Servants gently dabbing a pineapple with cloth, the way you or I might shine a pair of shoes. The trickle-down economy even reached local markets. Pineapple-patterned china, wallpapers, and textiles allowed wealthier merchants to mimic aristocratic taste without the actual fruit. Whole industries flourished around the illusion of pineapples. A family might never afford the fruit itself, but they could sip tea from pineapple-painted cups and feel slightly closer to fashionable society. And, of course, prices were staggering. A single fruit could cost as much as a servant's annual wage. In modern terms, it would be like paying thousands for a single mango. Yet the market persisted because the pineapple was not just food, it was an investment in reputation, a down payment on envy. As you leave the ledger's room, the columns of numbers blur into candlelight. Behind every glittering banquet and painted portrait lay this mountain of expense. Coal burned, glass purchased, servants exhausted, gardeners anxious. The pineapple was never just spiky skin and golden flesh. It was a pyramid of costs stacked high, crowned with one fragile, fragrant fruit. And as you drift further into the night, you chuckle at the thought. In Georgian England, the economy of pineapples might have been ridiculous, but it was also relentless. To grow one fruit was to burn money, and to display it was to gamble on glory. You wander into the bustling heart of London, where print shops on Fleet Street crank out sheets of satire as fast as the presses will run. The pineapple has made its way here too, though not with reverence. Instead, the fruit is lampooned, poked fun at, and caricatured until its spiky crown becomes shorthand for aristocratic folly. Imagine stepping into a print shop. The air smells of ink and candle smoke. Apprentices scurry with inky hands, and on the wall hangs the latest cartoon, a plump merchant straining to lift a pineapple larger than his head. The caption? Something cheeky like, "The burden of fashion." Customers chuckle, coins clink, and soon the caricature is pasted in coffee houses, where Londoners laugh over their tea. Historians still argue whether such satire dampened the pineapple craze, or fueled it by keeping the fruit in the public eye. Either way, the prints made clear that not everyone admired the aristocracy's fruity obsession. Some mocked the absurd expense of building glasshouses just to grow a single golden hedgehog, as one cartoon put it. Others skewered hosts who rented pineapples for show, portraying them as desperate social climbers. Quirky tidbit. In one especially popular caricature, a fashionable lady gazes lovingly at a pineapple while ignoring her crying child. The joke was obvious. The fruit had become more important than family. Another print depicted two politicians arguing in Parliament, each holding pineapples aloft as though they were dueling pistols. The message: policy was less pressing than prestige. Satirical verse joined the fun. Pamphlets circulated with poems mocking the vanity of fruit lords who boasted of pineapples while their tenants starved. One ballad sung in taverns rhymed, "He heats his fruit with coals so dear, while we freeze half the year." It wasn't subtle, but it struck a chord. Pineapples became a symbol not just of luxury, but of inequality. At the same time, satire made the fruit approachable for common folk. They might never taste one, but they could laugh at those who flaunted them. In a way, the pineapple democratized humor. Everyone could share a chuckle at aristocrats who built monuments to fruit. The laughter softened envy, turning spiky crowns into punchlines. You picture a coffee house buzzing with chatter, men in wigs tapping the latest print and laughing. One points to a pineapple drawn with human legs, running off with a sack of money. "There goes my landlord's rent," he quips, and the room erupts. The fruit's symbolic power has shifted, still potent, but no longer untouchable. And as you stand there, half smiling, half drowsy, you realize how fragile prestige can be. What was revered in one hall was ridiculed in another. The same pineapple that drew applause in a candlelit banquet could be mocked mercilessly in a print shop the next morning. The presses clatter on, the satire flows, and you drift further into the rhythm of it all, amused by the idea that a fruit once guarded by dogs and gardeners ended up as a butt of jokes pasted on tavern walls. In Georgian England, pineapples weren't just status. They were satire on legs, waddling spikily through both admiration and mockery. You wander into a quieter chamber of the manor, where the smell of dried herbs and stacks of botanical sketches fills the air. Here, among the orderly drawers of specimens, the pineapple takes on a scientific life. Georgian botanists, always hungry for new curiosities, treated the fruit as both marvel and mystery. The pineapple puzzled them. Unlike apples or pears, it didn't grow from a simple flower. It grew from a cluster of flowers fused together, each little diamond on the skin marking a blossom. Some scientists marveled at this, calling it a republic of fruit, as if each scale were a citizen contributing to the whole. Historians still argue whether Georgians fully understood the plant's botany or whether they simply wrapped it in flowery metaphors, but the fascination was undeniable. Quirky tidbit. Some botanists gave the pineapple grand Latin names like Ananas commosis, but others proposed fanciful titles, such as Bromelia ananas, arguing over classifications with more passion than most people reserve for football scores. Their debates filled journals, with one gentleman declaring that the fruit's spiral pattern revealed the geometry of God's hand. Another insisted it proved theories of natural symmetry, waving the fruit around like a chalkboard diagram. Natural philosophers also experimented with pineapple cultivation. They dissected roots, drew diagrams of hothouse layouts, and argued about the best compost mixtures. Some suggested adding powdered shells or seaweed to the soil. Others swore by horse manure alone. Experiments were conducted with almost religious devotion, though the results were inconsistent. You imagine them pacing nervously, quills in hand, recording day 47. Still no fruit. And beyond England, specimens were shipped back and forth across Europe. Pineapples appeared in botanical gardens in Holland, France, and even Russia, where the fruit was coaxed to grow in heated conservatories. Letters flew across the continent, with botanists boasting of successes and lamenting failures. A network of scientific gossip sprang up, the pineapple at its center like a celebrity everyone wanted to claim. The fruit also made its way into learned societies. Papers were read aloud to rooms of gentlemen in wigs, discussing not trade routes or politics, but the mysteries of pineapple reproduction. One presenter solemnly compared the plant's flowering process to a great chorus of nature. Listeners nodded, some impressed, others perhaps struggling not to yawn. Yet not everyone agreed. Some critics called the pineapple overrated, dismissing it as a curiosity inflated by fashion. The orange is more wholesome, the apple more useful, one essay sniffed. Still, the pineapple's allure endured. It was exotic, strange, and perfectly suited to an age obsessed with cataloging the wonders of the world. As you lean over a sketchbook filled with careful cross-sections, the lines blur in the candlelight. You sense the blend of science and spectacle that defined the Georgian era. To them, a pineapple wasn't just dessert. It was proof of empire, a puzzle for botanists, a geometric wonder hinting at divine design. And as you close the sketchbook, you realize science and obsession often march together. In Georgian England, curiosity about the pineapple was as spiky as the fruit itself, sharp, passionate, sometimes a little ridiculous, but always sincere. You drift from the botanist's chamber into a bustling marketplace, where a basket of apples, pears, and root vegetables spill across wooden stalls. Against this backdrop of ordinary produce, the pineapple gleams like a foreign jewel. But it wasn't alone in the exotic parade. Georgian England saw a steady stream of other fruits vying for attention. Melons, bananas, even the occasional orange, each threatening, in its own way, to steal the pineapple's crown. Imagine strolling past the stalls in Covent Garden. There, nestled among humble cabbages, sits a melon, plump and fragrant, advertised as grown in English soil. Melons have been cultivated in Europe for centuries, but they carried a faint whiff of the exotic, and Georgian society adored them in summer. Some even argue that melons were the true aristocratic fruit, easier to grow in hotbeds and far less demanding than pineapples. Historians still argue whether melons were considered rivals or mere understudies, but their popularity was undeniable. Quirky tidbit. One satirical pamphlet joked that the melon is the poor man's pineapple, suggesting that anyone who couldn't afford the tropical treasure could at least pretend with a slice of melon. It was less spiky, less dramatic, but infinitely cheaper, and less likely to bankrupt your coal supply. Bananas, meanwhile, began trickling into England through Caribbean connections. They fascinated Georgians with their curved shape and soft texture, though some were put off by the mushiness. Guests at parties sometimes sampled them with hesitation, wondering aloud if they were fit for digestion. Yet their novelty made them conversation pieces, and like pineapples, they hinted at Britain's expanding empire. And then there were oranges, long associated with luxury thanks to orangeries on country estates. By the 1700s, oranges were more familiar, but they still carried prestige. An estate might boast both an orangery and a pinery, as if to say, we command citrus and spikes alike. Some hosts served candied orange peel alongside pineapple slices, creating a duet of sunshine flavors in otherwise gloomy winters. But none of these rivals quite dethroned the pineapple. It had something the others lacked: spectacle. Its spiny crown and golden body were visual theater. You couldn't build a folly shaped like a melon without it looking like a squat dome. You couldn't crown your gates with bananas without giggles. The pineapple alone lent itself to architecture, to symbolism, to endless bragging rights. Still, the comparisons mattered. Guests often debated which exotic fruit tasted best. Some found pineapples too sharp, preferring the mellow sweetness of melons. Others liked the refreshing tang of oranges. The pineapple's edge lay not in taste, but in rarity. As one Georgian diarist noted, an orange may refresh the body, but a pineapple elevates the spirit. Translation: the pineapple made you look rich. And so, as you wander through the market, you picture these fruits jostling for attention. The melon with its sweet flesh, the banana with its curious form, the orange with its bright zest, all attractive, but none quite able to rival the pineapple's reign. It was the king of fruits, not because it was tastier, but because it looked like royalty. As you drift away from the stalls, the chatter of sellers fading into the night, you can't help but smile. The pineapple might have faced rivals, but in Georgian England, prestige wasn't about flavor. It was about spectacle. And no fruit staged a show quite like the pineapple. You leave the noisy marketplace behind and find yourself back on the manicured lawns of a country estate, where visitors shuffle along gravel paths, eager for their tour. Georgian households didn't just open their doors for portraits or tea. They opened them for a kind of horticultural theater. Guests weren't brought first to see the grand staircase or family portraits. No, they were ushered toward the hothouses, where pineapples basked in humid glory behind walls of glass. Imagine a carriage rolling up the drive. Out steps a party of ladies and gentlemen in powdered wigs, parasols shading their faces. They've come not just to visit friends, but to see the fabled pinery. The host beams with pride, guiding them past fountains and statues, until at last they stand before the glasshouse. Inside, pineapples sit in neat rows, spiky crowns catching the light. Gasps ripple through the group. Remarkable, someone whispers, as if viewing a holy relic. Historians still argue whether these tours were genuine hospitality or subtle one-upmanship. Likely both. To reveal a thriving pineapple was to flex wealth, connections, and horticultural genius all at once. A successful fruit elevated not just the estate, but its owner's reputation in county gossip. Quirky tidbit. Some estate guides kept guest books where visitors signed after viewing the pineapple collection, as though it were a museum. A few even sketched quick drawings of the fruit, proof they had seen it with their own eyes. Imagine pages filled with neat Georgian handwriting. June 14th, 1768. Witness a noble pineapple lord. Quite divine. The tours themselves were highly choreographed. Servants opened doors at just the right moment, releasing warm air tinged with tropical fragrance. Guests dabbed their noses with lace handkerchiefs, pretending not to mind the faint odor of manure that clung to the heat beds. Children gawked at the spiky plants as if they were dragons in pots. Adults asked polite questions about soil mixtures they didn't understand. The gardener stood nearby, stiff with pride, knowing his career might hinge on these admiring nods. Inside the manor, the pineapples often reappeared in display cabinets, sometimes alongside exotic shells or stuffed birds. Guests strolling through the drawing rooms encountered the fruit again, this time polished and posed, as if to remind them, yes, we really did grow this. The house itself became a kind of pineapple museum, with the fruit glowing like a tropical jewel amid mahogany and velvet. But the tours weren't without tension. What if the pineapple failed to impress? What if it looked small, pale, or oddly shaped? Hosts fretted endlessly. Some even delayed tours until the fruit was perfectly ripe, instructing servants to stall guests with tea and cake, while gardeners gave the pineapple one last polish. The pressure was immense. After all, reputations could be made or broken on the strength of a single fruit. And yet, these visits worked. Guests returned home chattering about the pineapple they had seen, carrying the tale into parlors and coffee houses. You must see the marvel at Lord S. Estate, they urged. Word spread, reputation swelled, and the pineapple continued its reign as both horticultural triumph and social magnet. As you stroll away from the estate, you picture the soft crunch of gravel beneath carriage wheels, the murmurs of admiration, the laughter spilling out of glasshouses glowing like lanterns in the dusk. Georgian society had turned fruit into theater, gardens into stages, and country estates into tropical museums. And as you drift further into the night, you realize sometimes prestige isn't about what you taste. It's about what others see you looking at. You step away from the quiet English countryside and follow the fruit's strange journey abroad, where pineapples became tokens of diplomacy not only in Georgian England but across Europe and beyond. Picture crates lined with straw, carefully packed in Caribbean ports, then carried across rough seas and bumpy roads, destined for courts where they dazzled as much as jewels. In France, pineapples found their way into the hands of aristocrats who prided themselves on joie de vivre and lavish display. Versailles already overflowed with gilded halls and exotic gardens, but a pineapple could still make courtiers lean in with admiration. Historians still argue whether Louis XV truly enjoyed eating the fruit or preferred the attention it drew at feasts, but his chefs worked recipes into elaborate pastries nonetheless. French satirists joked that nobles treated pineapples as diplomatic ambassadors in armor, too expensive to cut, too precious to ignore. Quirky tidbit. One banquet in Paris displayed a pineapple surrounded by 20 mirrors, so that guests saw dozens of reflections glowing in candlelight. Most never tasted it, but the illusion alone created murmurs of envy. The fruit traveled farther still. In Russia, Catherine the Great's botanist built heated conservatories to coax pineapples into ripening despite the snow outside. Visitors marveled at the contradiction. Spiky tropical plants thriving within sight of frozen rivers. For Catherine, the fruit wasn't just a delicacy. It was proof that Russia could rival Western Europe in luxury. Even the Ottoman court received pineapples as gifts, tucked into shipments of curiosities from British envoys. Imagine a fruit being carried into a chamber rich with carpets and incense, presented as evidence of British imperial abundance. It must have seemed strange, an exotic ore from a faraway colony, introduced as a symbol of friendship. Back in England, letters from diplomats proudly reported these fruity exchanges. The Sultan received our pineapple with great pleasure, one envoy scribbled, as though the empire's prestige rested on a single spiky fruit. Did the recipients truly value it? Historians debate the sincerity. Perhaps they admired the novelty, or perhaps they chuckled privately at England's obsession. But the symbolism was powerful. To carry a pineapple across borders was to carry empire itself, an edible emblem of trade routes, plantations, and naval power. The fruit was proof that Britain could bend nature to its will, coaxing tropical wonders from distant lands and delivering them intact to foreign courts. You imagine standing at one of these banquets, the fruit resting on a silver tray, candles throwing golden highlights across its scales. Around you, murmurs ripple in French, Russian, Turkish, different languages, same awe. The pineapple didn't need translation. It whispered of wealth, reach, and the strange human impulse to turn food into power. As you drift from one glittering court to another, you realize how far the pineapple's reputation traveled. It wasn't confined to English estates. It became part of the global conversation, a silent ambassador sent across seas. And though its flesh may have spoiled quickly, its image lingered, glowing in the minds of kings and queens, long after the fruit itself had vanished into compost or memory. You wander back toward the warmth of the kitchen, where copper pots glint and the air hums with clattering knives. Here, the pineapple sheds some of its diplomatic weight and lands squarely in the hands of Georgian cooks. Though rare, when one of these fruits was finally sacrificed to the knife, it could be transformed into recipes both extravagant and experimental. Imagine a pineapple sliced into thin golden wedges, layered into a trifle of sponge cake, custard, and whipped cream. Guests dipped spoons carefully, savoring the tang beneath all the sweetness. Cookbooks of the era sometimes included instructions for such desserts, though always with a quiet caveat that apples or quinces might be substituted when the pineapple cannot be had. Which, of course, meant almost always. Quirky tidbit. Pineapple wine became a brief fad. Recipes advised soaking chopped pineapple in sugar and brandy for weeks until it turned into a fragrant, fizzy drink. Some diarists swore it had an effect most sprightly on the nerves. Others admitted sheepishly that it gave them headaches. Either way, it kept pineapples in circulation long after their flesh would otherwise have spoiled. Historians still argue whether Georgians genuinely liked the taste of pineapple or simply enjoyed the theater of it. Some letters gush about its sweetness, a nectar fit for Olympus. Others complain it was too sharp upon the tongue and better candied than fresh. It may be that the fruit's rarity created more excitement than its flavor ever could. In aristocratic kitchens, pineapples sometimes met a more decorative fate. They were carved into elaborate garnishes, set atop cakes, or studded into meat roasts more for show than taste. A Georgian dinner guest might encounter pineapple in the most unexpected places, floating in punch, topping ice cream, or even simmered into savory sauces. You imagine a cook wiping sweat from his brow, muttering, all this for one blasted fruit, while arranging pineapple slices into precise sunburst patterns. There was risk, too. If the pineapple was underripe, the dish failed, and the host's prestige suffered. One satirical anecdote describes a host serving pineapple pie so sour that guests' wigs nearly lifted from their heads as they tried not to grimace. Yet everyone applauded politely, because who dared criticize such expensive delicacy? The kitchen also became a stage for storytelling. Servants whispered about the pineapple's Caribbean origins while slicing it, passing on tales of plantations and voyages. For them, it wasn't just food, but evidence of empire, of wealth that trickled down in the form of scraps and peelings they might sneak a taste of. To nibble a corner of pineapple rind was to touch luxury, even if it puckered the mouth. And beyond the manner, pineapple-flavored treats slowly seeped into city life. Confectioners in London experimented with candied pineapple sold in little boxes, often using imported syrup rather than fresh fruit. The advertisements promised a tropical taste for all seasons, though most buyers knew they were purchasing little more than sweetened imagination. As you lean against the warm stone of the kitchen, the smell of roasted meats and sugared fruits mingling in the air, you see how the pineapple became more than a showpiece. It was worked into recipes, fussed over in kitchens, whispered about in diaries. Sometimes it delighted, sometimes it disappointed, but always it mattered. And as you drift toward sleep, you picture a Georgian cook spooning pineapple custard into delicate porcelain dishes, his hands steady despite the pressure. Outside, guests chatter, ready to be amazed. The fruit may not always have lived up to its hype, but in those kitchens, it found ways to shine, or at least a surprise. You leave the kitchen's bustle and step into a Georgian drawing room, where the conversation drifts from politics to poetry, and once again the pineapple pops up, not on the table this time, but in language itself. The fruit became a metaphor, an easy stand-in for qualities people admired, envied, or mocked. Georgians were nothing if not inventive with their words, and the pineapple turned into one of their favorite linguistic playthings. Perhaps the most famous phrase was the very pineapple of politeness. To call someone that was to crown them with the highest compliment, a way of saying they were the peak of refinement, the ultimate in social grace. Quirky tidbit. This phrase even made its way into satirical plays, where characters gush pineapple of politeness so often that audiences laugh at the absurd repetition. It became a stock joke, but the point remained. The pineapple was shorthand for excellence. Historians still argue whether this phrase grew out of genuine admiration or whether it was always intended as a playful exaggeration. Either way, the pineapple's rarity made it the perfect metaphor. You didn't call someone the apple of politeness. That would have sounded ordinary. A pineapple, though, that was special, almost unattainable. The fruit slid into other expressions as well. To praise a hostess, one might murmur, her conversation was the pineapple of elegance. To tease a friend, another might write in a letter, you think yourself the pineapple of wit, though I find you more a turnip. These turns of phrase fluttered through salons and coffee houses, where wit was as valuable as coin. In poetry, too, the pineapple appeared as metaphor for beauty and temptation. One poet compared his beloved smile to the sweetness of the pineapple's heart. Another, less tactfully, warned a false friend spiny without, yet sweet within. The fruit's dual nature, armored skin, soft center, made it irresistible to wordsmiths hunting for imagery. And sometimes, the metaphors went sour. Critics mocked ostentatious displays by sneering that a man was all pineapple crown, no sweetness inside. Satirical pamphlets lampooned nouveau riche merchants for parading pineapples they didn't actually own, calling them borrowed fruits. Language captured both admiration and derision, just as the fruit itself could be both revered and ridiculed. Picture yourself seated by a fireplace, listening to these conversations. Gentle laughter ripples as someone delivers the pineapple punchline of the evening. You sip your wine, half amused, half sleepy, realizing that in Georgian England, metaphors weren't idle wordplay. They were social currency. To wield the pineapple cleverly in speech was to prove your wit as surely as displaying one on your table prove your wealth. As the fire crackles low, the chatter softens, and you lean back into your chair. The pineapple glows in imagination, no longer a fruit but a symbol of politeness, of grace, of vanity, of wit. Its spiky crown sits lightly on every phrase, reminding you that even language wasn't immune to the craze. And so you drift onward, amused at how a tropical fruit crept into Georgian vocabulary, becoming a compliment, a joke, a warning, all at once. Words like pineapples were cultivated, traded, displayed, and savored slowly, bite by bite. You step outside the manor walls and walk across the state grounds, only to stumble upon a ruin, an abandoned glass house, its roof panes cracked, bricks crumbling, vines curling through empty frames. The once proud pinery now lies in silence, a ghost of Georgian obsession. The pineapple's reign, it seems, was not eternal. In the early decades, these structures have been marvels. Heated channels humming, gardeners bustling, guests gasping. But fashions change, and when the pineapple frenzy waned, many of these glass houses fell into neglect. Coal was costly, glass fragile, and society's attention had shifted toward other luxuries. Soon weeds invaded, doors sagged on rusty hinges, and what had once been temples of horticulture turned into derelict shells. Historians still argue whether the decline came from practical economics or shifting tastes. Some say the influx of imported pineapples, arriving cheaper and fresher thanks to improved shipping, made homegrown versions less impressive. Others suggest that aristocrats simply grew bored. The fruit no longer dazzled when too many people had seen one. Whatever the cause, the states quietly allowed their pineries to wither, their proudest trophies turning into melancholic ruins. Quirky tidbit. One traveler's diary from the 1790s describes exploring an abandoned pinery where local boys dared each other to run inside at night, claiming the ghosts of dead pineapples rattled the broken glass. He admitted the only sound he heard was a squeak of mice, but the legend stuck, adding a comic spookiness to the ruins. For visitors, these decaying glass houses became curiosities. Tourists touring grand estates in later centuries would pause before the remnants, marveling at the folly of spending fortunes on fruit. Some even called them monuments of vanity, likening them to ancient temples built for forgotten gods. In truth, they were monuments to fashion, their collapse as swift as their rise. And yet, even in ruin, they held a certain beauty. Picture moonlight filtering through shattered panes, casting broken shards of reflection onto stone floors. Ivy drapes the walls. Birds nest where pineapples once grew, and silence reigns where once coal fires roared. You can almost hear the faint echoes of gardeners stoking furnaces, of guests gasping at the fruit's glow, now replaced by the rustle of leaves and the drip of rain. The abandoned glasshouses remind you how quickly obsessions fade. What was once the pinnacle of prestige became rubble within a generation. The pineapple, so rare and envied, lost its magic once the market caught up. Today, most of those pineries are gone, dismantled or left to decay, remembered only in estate records and scattered ruins. As you step away, the image lingers. The ruins are symbolic as a fruit ever was, a reminder that status, like pineapples, ripens, dazzles, and eventually rots. The spiky crown that once ruled over Georgian banquets now lies buried under moss and dust. And as you walk on, drowsy under the quiet night, you realize how history loves its cycles of passion and neglect. The pineapple craze burned brightly, then crumbled, leaving behind glass skeletons that whisper of ambition, vanity, and time's slow patience. You drift from the broken glasshouses toward a small chapel on the estate, candlelight flickering faintly through its windows. Here, you discover yet another surprising chapter in the pineapple's life, religion. It may sound odd to link a tropical fruit with sermons, but in Georgian England, everything rare and fashionable eventually found its way into the pulpit. Preachers often use the pineapple as a metaphor for virtue, patience, and heavenly reward. They compared the slow, costly process of cultivating the fruit to the equally painstaking work of cultivating a moral soul. As the gardener tends a pineapple with diligence and care, one sermon declared, so must the Christian tend his heart. Historians still argue whether these sermons reflected genuine admiration for the fruit or whether ministers simply knew their congregations loved hearing about fashionable things. But the image stuck. Quirky tidbit. One clergyman in Bath allegedly decorated his church's harvest display with a pineapple at the very top, causing quite a stir. Parishioners whispered that it was a fruit too grand for humble thanksgiving. Others defended it, saying it symbolized God's bounty reaching even from distant lands. Either way, the spiky crown drew more attention than the turnips and wheat beneath it. In religious writings, pineapples sometimes represented temptation as well. Their exotic sweetness was likened to worldly pleasures, beautiful but fleeting, alluring yet dangerous. Ministers warned young parishioners not to become like the pineapple, outwardly golden yet inwardly perishable. The fruit became a sermon in itself, offering a lesson about vanity and the dangers of excess. At funerals, too, pineapples occasionally appeared as symbols of eternal life. Their crowns pointed heavenward, their rarity suggesting the reward of paradise. Some memorial plaques even included pineapple carvings among their decorative motifs, nestled beside angels and cherubs. It may seem strange now, but for Georgians steeped in symbolism, the pineapple could carry sacred weight. And in more domestic forms of piety, religious writers encourage moderation by contrasting the pineapple's extravagance with simpler fruits. Better to share an apple in love, one tract suggested, than to hoard a pineapple in pride. You picture a family gathered around a small wooden table, nodding in agreement, while secretly wishing they had a pineapple to hoard. Yet the pineapple's link to religion wasn't only moralizing, it was also celebratory. Some churches use pineapple motifs in decorative carvings, echoing its broader symbolism of hospitality and welcome. Parishioners entering a chapel crown with a pineapple finial might have smiled at the subtle suggestion. God's house, like a noble estate, offers abundance and warmth. As you step into the chapel, the candlelight glows across wooden pews. The air smells faintly of wax and damp stone. You imagine a minister raising his voice, weaving the pineapple into a sermon. Parishioners murmuring assent, their minds half on scripture, half on the strange, golden fruit from across the sea. And as you leave, the bells toll softly in the night. You realize that the pineapple's reach extended even here, into religion, where it became lesson, symbol, and ornament. In Georgian England, no corner of life was too sacred or too spiky for the pineapple to invade. You wander down a cobbled London street, lanterns swaying in the night air, until the scent of roast meats and tobacco draws you inside a tavern. Here, the pineapple shows a different face. Not just aristocratic luxury or religious metaphor, but a splash of fun and public entertainment. Georgian England adored novelty, and the pineapple was too tempting a prop to leave out its parties and plays. Theaters occasionally used pineapples as stage set pieces. A comedy might feature a pompous character parading a pineapple only to trip and drop it, sending the audience into laughter. Satirical plays mock social climbers desperate to rent the fruit, highlighting its absurd expense. Historians still argue whether real pineapples were sacrificed to these gags, or whether papier-mâché versions stood in. One theater diary hints cheekily that our pineapple has seen more encores than Hamlet, suggesting it was reused night after night. Quirky tidbit: masquerade balls sometimes featured guests in pineapple costumes. Picture elaborate papier-mâché crowns perched on powdered wigs, green leaves wobbling as dancers twirled. One account even describes a gentleman dressed head to toe as a pineapple, though the chronicler admitted he looked more like a porcupine in gold. Guests roared with laughter, but the point was made: the fruit was iconic enough to be instantly recognized, even in parody. Taverns and coffee houses joined the trend, naming drinks after fruit. Pineapple punch became a crowd pleaser, often flavored with rum and citrus rather than the actual fruit itself. Customers didn't care. The name alone promised exotic delight. A satirical pamphlet joked that half the punch bowls in London had never met a pineapple, yet they carried its name with pride. Street vendors also capitalized on the craze. Wooden toys shaped like pineapples appeared for sale, along with tin trinkets and cheap prints. Families who could never dream of tasting the fruit could still display a pineapple emblem on a shelf, sharing in the excitement from a distance. In this way, the fruit became both elite symbol and mass entertainment, bridging two very different worlds. At fairs, performers sometimes juggled pineapples or balanced them on sticks, delighting audiences. The spiky skin made them more dramatic than apples, and the crowd gasped at the idea of tossing such a precious item through the air. Whether those pineapples were real or fake remains uncertain, but the thrill was the same. The pineapple became theater, sometimes literally, and yet, even amid the laughter, its prestige wasn't lost. A man might chuckle at a stage gag and still go home wishing he could display the fruit at his own table. Humor didn't diminish the pineapple's allure. If anything, it kept the obsession alive by weaving it into public imagination. As you sip an imaginary mug of pineapple punch in the smoky tavern, laughter rolling around you, you feel the odd duality. The pineapple was both aristocrat and clown, both sacred banquet star and comic prop. It could command reverence in a chandelier hall, then tumble into slapstick on a stage. Few fruits could boast such range. And as you step back into the night, lanterns flickering, the laughter fading behind you, you realize the pineapple was more than a fruit. It was an entertainer, a jester with a crown, reminding Georgians that even luxury could make people laugh. You follow the laughter out of the tavern and onto the cobblestones, where candlelit shop windows beckon. Behind the glass, you spot another form of pineapple mania: souvenirs. Georgian England, ever eager to turn fashion into merchandise, produced an astonishing array of pineapple-themed goods: china, textiles, furniture, even spoons engraved with spiky crowns. If you couldn't afford the fruit itself, you could still buy its likeness. Walk into a porcelain shop in London and you'd find pineapple-shaped tureens, delicately painted, their lids lifting to reveal space for soup or custard. They were wildly popular among the wealthy, partly because they let hosts showcase pineapples even when no fruit was available. Quirky tidbit: some of these porcelain pineapples were so convincing that guests leaned forward at dinner to sniff them, only to discover they were filled with steaming broth. Historians still argue whether this proliferation of pineapple decor was genuine admiration or clever marketing. Did people truly love the fruit, or did artisans simply flood the market with its image because it sold? Either way, pineapple motifs appeared everywhere. Upholstery fabric featured repeating patterns of golden fruit. Carpets bore stylized crowns. Even bedposts were carved into pineapple finials, a reminder of hospitality as you drifted into dreams. Jewelry makers weren't left behind. Pineapple-shaped brooches and pendants adorned gowns, often in gold filigree with tiny green enamel leaves. To wear one was to hint at exotic sophistication, even if you had never tasted the fruit itself. Imagine a lady sweeping into a ballroom, her pineapple brooch glinting, while whispers followed her. She must be very fashionable indeed. Glassmakers joined in too, producing cut crystal decanters patterned to resemble pineapple skin. Wine sparkled inside them, catching candlelight in honeycomb facets. Guests raised their glasses, clinking with a faint echo of tropical prestige. And then there was furniture. Some side tables were carved with pineapple legs, and chairs upholstered with pineapple patterns. Gateposts across the countryside bore stone pineapples, welcoming visitors with spiky crowns. Walking up a drive crowned with pineapples was like passing through a gateway to fashion itself. This wave of merchandise made the pineapple both elite and accessible. True, only the wealthy could afford a real fruit, but a middle-class family might purchase a printed cloth with pineapple motifs or a modest ceramic trinket. The fruit's image trickled down through society, a kind of democratization of prestige. You couldn't eat one, but you could look at one every day. Of course, satire followed close behind. Caricaturists mocked households that drowned themselves in pineapple decor without ever owning the fruit. All pineapple, no taste. One caption sneered beneath a sketch of a parlor plastered with pineapple wallpaper. But the joke didn't slow demand. If anything, it fueled it. The pineapple remained irresistible as symbol, whether in porcelain or print. You step away from the shop window, picturing Georgian drawing rooms glowing with pineapple china, carpets, jewelry, and furniture. The fruit had escaped the greenhouse in the banquet hall. Now it lived in everyday objects, endlessly replicated, endlessly admired. And as you drift on, you realize the pineapple had become more than a luxury. It was a brand stamped across England's material culture, proof that even in the 18th century, fashion could turn anything, even a fruit, into a lifestyle. You wander into a cobbled street lined with flickering lanterns, and your ears catch the sound of laughter spilling from a coffee house. Inside, merchants and tradesmen lean over steaming cups, debating not politics this time, but pineapples. For while aristocrats flaunted the fruit in glasshouses and banquets, the rising middle class found their own ways to chase the spiky crown. Picture a prosperous brewer, proud of his growing fortune, renting a pineapple for an evening to impress his guests. His neighbors whispered about it for weeks, half admiring, half mocking. Quirky tidbit. Advertisements even appeared offering pineapple for hire by the night, making the fruit sound suspiciously like a performer rather than produce. These rentals gave ambitious families a taste of high society, without the ruinous expense of building their own pinery. Historians still argue whether this middle-class adoption diluted the fruit's prestige or cemented it. Some suggest that as merchants embraced pineapples, the aristocracy grew bored and moved on. Others believe the fruit's popularity was only magnified. More people saw it, more people coveted it, and so the craze persisted longer. In city taverns, exotic fruit became a way to boast about travel connections. A grocer might set a pineapple in his shop window, not to sell it, but to prove he had access to Caribbean imports. Passers-by gawked. Children pressed noses at glass, and customers walked away thinking the shopkeeper must be well connected indeed. Domestic households joined the fun through imitation. Middle-class families purchased pineapple pattern wallpaper or cheap ceramic trinkets shaped like the fruit. It wasn't quite the same as serving pineapple custard at a dinner party, but it still signaled taste and aspiration. You can almost hear the chatter. We may not own a pineapple, but look at our pineapple teapot. Prestige, watered down yet still potent. Coffee houses amplified the craze. Patrons debated whether pineapples were truly worth a fuss. Some grumbled about their sharp taste. Others swore they were ambrosia. The arguments grew animated, fueled by coffee and pride, until someone declared that only the foolish would pay so dearly for a fruit. Yet even as they mocked, they leaned closer to catch the scent of any pineapple that happened to appear. The pineapple also became a sly metaphor for social climbing. Plays and novels poked fun at merchants' daughters paraded with pineapples to catch noble husbands. Satirists laughed at clerks who saved for weeks to glimpse the fruit at exhibitions. And yet, behind the satire, you sense admiration. The middle class was determined to taste the luxuries once reserved for aristocrats, even if only in borrowed or symbolic form. As you leave the coffee house, the laughter fading into the night, you reflect on the pineapple's curious double life. It was both untouchable and rentable, aristocratic and middle class, mocked and admired. It allowed families to dream, to climb, to play at grandeur, even if just for an evening. And so, drifting through the lamplit streets, you realize that the pineapple's power wasn't only in its rarity. It was in the way it crossed boundaries, letting everyone, from dukes to drapers, participate in its absurd, spiky theater. You step into a London shop glittering with polished glass cases, and here the pineapple shows up again. Not as food, not as decor and wallpaper or furniture, but as keepsakes. Georgian consumers adored objects that let them carry the prestige of the pineapple home, even if they never tasted its sharp sweetness. Porcelain makers led the charge. Delicate terrines shaped like pineapples grace sideboards, their lids lifting to reveal soups or custards. Some were painted in vivid yellow and green, others in dainty blue and white to suit fashionable tastes. Guests often mistook them for real fruit until they leaned closer. Quirky tidbit. One aristocrat reportedly delighted in fooling visitors by lifting the porcelain lid and ladling out broth, to the amusement or horror of those who expected exotic slices. Historians still argue whether these souvenirs democratized the pineapple or cheapened it. Did the porcelain pineapple allow middling families to join the craze, or did it remind everyone they couldn't afford the real thing? Either way, the replicas multiplied. Silver workshops joined in too, crafting pineapple-shaped table ornaments and candlesticks. To see a dining table crowned with pineapple silverware was to read a clear message. We admire the fashion, and we can afford its echo. These objects glittered under candlelight, eternal pineapples immune to rot. Textiles picked up the motif as well. Silk patterns featured repeating pineapple crowns, woven in gold thread. Upholstered chairs boasted embroidered pineapples. Even bed hangings bore the symbol, so a guest might literally sleep beneath the fruit's watchful spikes. Pineapple chintz, cheaper but still fashionable, trickled into middle-class parlors, ensuring that everyone could dream of tropical prestige. Booksellers got on the act, too. Decorative bookplates and engravings featuring pineapples circulated widely, serving as stylish markers of taste. A gentleman could own a library without ever tasting pineapple, but his bookplate told visitors he was as refined as any duke. The keepsakes sometimes outlived the craze itself. Long after the fruit's novelty faded, families passed down porcelain pineapples and pineapple-patterned silver. Some of these pieces survive today, tucked into museum cases, still spiky, still gleaming, long after the fruit itself would have crumbled into dust. Walking through the shop, you realize these souvenirs made the pineapple immortal. Unlike the real fruit, fragile and quick to spoil, the keepsakes endured, freezing fashion in porcelain and silver. They allowed Georgians to capture a fleeting obsession, turning it into heirlooms. As you leave, the cases shimmer behind you, each pineapple shining softly in the candlelight. The fruit may have been temporary, but its image lingered, etched into objects that outlasted its season. And you drift on, amused by the thought that sometimes the copies survive longer than the original, carrying prestige into the future one porcelain spike at a time. You wander from the glittering shop into a quieter salon, where the air hums with conversation and the soft rustle of silk gowns. Here, pineapples are not on tables or walls, but in the chatter itself, woven into gossip, jokes, and sly little stories that travel faster than the fruit itself ever could. Imagine a group of ladies gathered over tea, their cups clinking gently. One leans forward and whispers, "Did you hear? Lady so-and-so served pineapple again last night." Gasps follow, half envy, half disdain. Quirky tidbit. In one diary entry, a guest described how a hostess, unable to secure fruit in time, placed a wax replica on the table instead. It fooled no one, the diarist wrote gleefully, and the poor woman was roasted by rumor before dawn. Historians still argue whether gossip amplified the pineapple craze, or simply mirrored it. Some say the fruit's reputation was built less on its actual taste and more on the endless tales told about it. Others believe gossip kept the obsession alive, transforming each pineapple sighting into a minor social event. Coffee houses buzzed with similar talk. Merchants bragged about shipments. Clerks exaggerated their encounters. I had a slice just last week. One might say, though a slice was likely borrowed imagination. The fruit became a kind of conversational currency. Mentioning it proved you moved in fashionable circles, whether true or not. What also played its part. Writers and periodicals crafted jokes about pineapple mania, teasing the nouveau riche for bankrupting themselves over fruit. One satirical poem joked that a man may dine on bread alone, if only a pineapple crowns a table. Audiences chuckled, then repeated the lines in drawing rooms, spreading the joke farther than any pineapple could travel. And then there were the cautionary tales. A hostess who served sour pineapple was doomed to whispers. Her gardener failed her. Poor thing. A gentleman who flaunted too many pineapples risked being called vain or vulgar. The fruit could elevate or humiliate, depending on the story told afterward. You can almost hear the crackle of gossip in the air. Quieter than politics, lighter than scandal, but persistent, sticky. Pineapples slipped into letters too. Friends wrote teasingly, "May your fortunes ripen as steadily as your pineapples." Lovers sent metaphors about sweetness and longing, though sometimes clumsily. One poor suitor compared a beloved's hair to pineapple leaves, which earned him ridicule rather than affection. The chatter itself became part of the pineapple's allure. Even those who never saw one in person felt they knew it, thanks to endless retellings. A fruit that was rare in reality became common in conversation, a symbol everyone could chew over, even if they never tasted a bite. As you step away from the salon, the voices fade, leaving you with the sense that gossip gave the pineapple its true immortality. Banquets ended, fruits rotted, glasshouses crumbled, but stories lingered, whispered, embroidered, and passed along. And in Georgian England, sometimes a good story mattered more than the fruit itself. You slip away from the hum of salons and into a quieter chamber, where architect sketches are spread across a table. Here, the pineapple takes on stone and brick, rising not just as fruit or metaphor, but as architecture. Georgian England loved to build monuments to its obsessions, and the pineapple was no exception. The most famous example stands in Dunmore, Scotland, where a great stone pineapple crowns a garden folly. 37 feet tall, carved in astonishing detail, it looms over the countryside like a spiky sentinel. Quirky tidbit. The stone fruit is so carefully crafted that its carved scales swell outward just like a real pineapple's, capturing not only prestige but botanical accuracy. Travelers who stumble upon it today often laugh in disbelief. A castle crowned with fruit, and yet there it is, as serious as any cathedral. Historians still argue why the Earl of Dunmore built it. Some say it was pure whimsy, a bold joke in stone. Others suggest it symbolized hospitality and empire, or even his personal connection to the tropics. Whatever the reason, it endures as the world's most extravagant pineapple house, both folly and monument. Beyond Dunmore, smaller architectural pineapples sprouted across Britain. Gateposts bore stone crowns, welcoming guests with a symbol of hospitality. Finials on staircases mimicked the fruit's form. Even church spires occasionally featured pineapple motifs, their upward thrust symbolizing both welcome and aspiration. For Georgian eyes, a pineapple carved in stone was more than decoration. It was a declaration. This house belongs to someone worldly, generous, and modern. And then there were temporary constructions. At great feasts, wooden pineapples gilded in gold leaf appeared as stage props, towering over banquet tables. Guests marveled, though some joked that they looked more like armored hedgehogs than tropical fruit. Still, the message was clear. Pineapple meant spectacle. You could almost imagine walking up the long drive to a country house, lanterns glowing, and seeing twin stone pineapples perched on the gate. They smiled down at you, silent greeters in spiky crowns. They promised welcome, but also whisper of empire and ambition. The fruit had escaped the dining hall and entered the landscape itself. In architecture, the pineapple became timeless. Unlike the fragile fruit, these stone versions did not rot. They survived storms, decades, and centuries long after craze waned. They are still there today, dotting Britain's countryside, reminders of Georgian obsession carved into permanence. As you leave the architect's chamber, you carry the image of Dunmore's great stone crown glowing in moonlight. The fruit may have been fleeting, but its shadow endures in stone, an eternal folly that still makes visitors blink, smile, and whisper, "Why on earth a pineapple? You drift away from Dunmore Stony Crown and find yourself in the hushed parlor of a Georgian townhouse, where the air feels heavier, quieter, touched with a hint of melancholy. For now, the pineapple craze is waning. What once dazzled in candlelight and dominated gossip columns begins to feel overdone, passé, even a little ridiculous. Why? Partly economics. Imported pineapples grew cheaper as shipping routes improved. Faster ships and better preservation meant tropical fruits could reach London in greater numbers. Suddenly, what had been a once-in-a-lifetime marvel was merely uncommon. Historians still argue whether it was falling prices or sheer overexposure that ended the mania, but either way, the aura of exclusivity was gone. Quirky tidbit. One London fruit seller advertised pineapples stacked like cabbages in his shop window by the early 1800s. A crowd gathered, not out of awe but out of amusement, muttering that the fruit looked more common than cabbages. A century earlier, people might have bowed to such a sight. Now they chuckled. Taste also played a role. For all its prestige, not everyone loved the pineapple's sharp tang. Guests tolerated its flavor when it was rare. But once more people tried it, some admitted it wasn't worth the hype. Later survival diners calling it curious or novel, but preferring apples or pears. Without the sheen of rarity, the pineapple had fewer defenders. Meanwhile, fashions move on. The aristocracy, ever hungry for novelty, turned to other obsessions, new gardens, new architectural fancies, even different fruits. Strawberries, improved through selective breeding, became fashionable. Ice cream, once exotic, became more accessible. The pineapple was yesterday's marvel, and in a world obsessed with novelty, yesterday is unforgivable. And so the glasshouses began to close. Coal was too costly to burn for fruit that no longer shocked guests. Gardeners turned their skills to grapes or peaches. Abandoned pineries slowly crumbled, their bricks reclaimed for stables or walls. A few stubborn estates kept them going, but most let the fires die out. For ordinary people, the decline meant opportunity. Pineapple motifs remain on crockery, wallpapers, and trinkets, but now as decorative nostalgia rather than cutting-edge fashion. The fruit shifted from dazzling symbol to cozy emblem of hospitality. A pineapple carved into a gatepost still welcomed visitors, but no one gasped in awe anymore. You pause in this parlor, picturing a half-forgotten pineapple centerpiece, no longer admired, just part of the clutter. Dust gathers on porcelain pineapples. Gossip columns turn to new scandals, and the fruit that once ruled England's imagination fades quietly into background decoration. As you drift onward, you sense the inevitability of it all. No obsession lasts forever. The pineapple's decline was as dramatic as its rise, reminding you that even the spikiest crown eventually dulls in fashion's restless court. You leave the dim parlor decline and step into a brighter hall, where sunlight filters through tall windows and the pineapple begins a quieter second life. No longer a fiery obsession of aristocrats, it softens into a symbol of welcome, a gesture of warmth that lingers long after the craze has passed. Hospitality became its lasting legacy. Across Georgian and later Victorian England, pineapples were carved into gateposts, etched onto door knockers, and embroidered into table linens. To greet a guest beneath a pineapple motif was to say, without words, "You are cherished here." Historians still argue whether this association grew directly from Georgian banquets or from older Caribbean traditions where the pineapple was used to welcome visitors. Either way, by the 19th century, the fruit had shed much of its vanity and taken on the gentler role of household greeter. Quirky tidbit. Some inns even displayed pineapples carved into their signboards, advertising not just bed but spirit of friendliness. Travelers reported spotting them along country roads, glowing faintly in lantern light as symbols of rest and refuge. Cookbooks, too, continued to feature fruit, though by now imported pineapples were far more accessible. A middle-class hostess might serve pineapple jam or pineapple jelly at tea, not as earth-shattering spectacle, but as a sweet treat. What once was reserved for dukes now appeared in modest dining rooms, democratized at last. Architecture carried the emblem farthest. Pineapple finials crowned staircases, pillars, and garden walls. Decorative stone pineapples appeared in churches, their spiky crowns softened by lichen, signaling both welcome and continuity. They have become part of the visual language of home and hearth, more enduring than the fleeting banquets of Georgian elites. Yet the memory of the craze never vanished completely. Writers of the 19th century look back with amusement at the pineapple mania of earlier days. One called it a spiny madness, another a folly both fragrant and absurd. And still, even as they mocked, they preserved the fruit's symbolic meaning. As you stand in the sunlit hall, you realize the pineapple's transformation is complete. No longer the crown jewel of glasshouses, no longer a rented guest of banquets. It is mellowed into something more humane. It welcomes rather than intimidates, comforts rather than dazzles. And as you drift onward, you smile at this quieter fate. The pineapple, once the terror of gardeners and the jewel of aristocrats, has settled into its final role. Not tyrant, not folly, but friendly emblem. Still spiky on the outside, but warm in meaning within. You step into the last chamber of this long, drowsy journey. A quiet study where firelight glows low and shadows stretch across the walls. The pineapple, after its strange odyssey through Georgian England, rests here not as a spectacle, not as satire, but as memory. Its story has ripened fully, from fragile fruit to architectural crown, from banquet centerpiece to museum relic. You think of the gardeners sweating over coal fires, tending soil with anxious precision, hoping one fruit might survive. You recall the ladies painted with pineapples perched beside them, symbols of refinement and fragile reputation. You picture the tavern jokes, the gossip over tea, the great stone folly of Dunmore still standing defiantly against Scottish skies. Historians still argue whether the pineapple truly deserved all this attention, or whether it was merely a spiky mirror reflecting human vanity. But the debate itself is part of the story. The fruit endures because people kept talking, drawing, mocking, admiring. Quirky tidbit. A few pineapples even became family mascots. Preserved, dried, or lacquered, they sat in cabinets for decades, introduced proudly to guests as the fruit that once graced our table. Imagine grandchildren rolling their eyes as elders dusted a shriveled relic, insisting it was once the pride of the family's estate. What began as a colonial curiosity grew into obsession, then softened into hospitality, and finally settled into history. The pineapple's path is absurd, poignant, and oddly human. We turn a fruit into theater, into politics, into metaphor, into stone. And though its power waned, its spiky crown still pricks our imagination. So now, as you sit in this fireless study, you let the story fade into a softer rhythm. The fruit no longer dazzles under chandeliers. It glows quietly in memory. Its long shadow stretches not across banquet tables, but across the gentle field of history, where obsessions bloom, rot, and leave behind curious relics. And as your eyes grow heavier, you sense the pineapple had completed its work. It entertained, impressed, and even comforted. Now it bows politely and withdraws, leaving you with only the faint echo of candlelight, the whisper of laughter in Georgian halls, and the soft crackle of memory. Now the story slows, soft as a hush that follows a closing book. You lean back, feeling the weight of centuries slip away, until the pineapple's spiky crown is no longer a symbol of empire or vanity, but just a curious shape resting gently in your imagination. The edges blur, the noise of banquets and gossip, of coal fires and laughter, drifts into silence. You are left only with the faintest glow, as if a single candle burns at the far end of a long hall. The fruit's golden sheen softens into warm amber, its sharp tang melts into sweetness, and its crown folds into quiet shadows of sleep. There is comfort here in knowing that every obsession eventually fades, every fashion quiets, and what remains is gentler, easier to carry. The pineapple story is no longer about rivalry or cost, but about welcome, about the simple act of setting something bright upon a table to say, you belong here. So breathe slowly now. Let the air move in and out like the tide against distant shores. Picture yourself stepping through a doorway crowned with stone pineapples, their spikes softened by moss, their weight softened by time. You pass beneath them, safe, calm, welcomed. The night stretches wide, the stars above steady and kind. Whatever worries pressed at you earlier, let them drop away like overripe fruit, falling harmlessly into soft earth. You are carried forward into rest, into warmth, into the steady rhythm of your own breath. And there, in that stillness, the pineapple's long journey is complete. Its crown lowers, the candles dim, and the story folds into sleep.